welcome everyone to the first breakout session. I'm Ted Haberman, and Margaret O'Brien from Santa Barbara and LTER, I guess, and other interesting groups, and Matt Jones from NCs and Data One and I pulled this together. Peter Slaughter from NCs is also a member of the team, but unfortunately he couldn't get here. The format of this session is going to be hopefully some fairly short talks to introduce why we're doing this, and then some work that Matt and Peter and I did, and Sean Gordon also here did with the Data One repository, and then we're going to break into 4 groups. Aaron today mentioned the role that ESIP had in a few years ago with the data citation guidelines, and I think I'll reveal my hidden agenda at this point. It may be that we end up with an ESIP recommendation for fair metadata, and so what we're hoping to do today is to use your experience and knowledge to help us sort of divide up or to identify metadata elements, metadata concepts really, that support the FAIR principles. So if you want to be thinking, we plan to have a breakout group for each letter, FAIR, and those groups will look at some Git repository issues, and the links to those are in the description of the session in Schedule. There's 4 of them, and between now and the beginning of that, we'll explain what we're going to do in those groups. But so that's sort of the plan. So my role in this is to talk about why we're doing this and how we might think about measuring the FAIR principles, and back to this and this. So this is a quote from the Wilkinson paper that introduced this idea of FAIR, and a diverse set of stakeholders. We have a diverse set of stakeholders here: academia, and industry, funding, and scholarly publishers, all here. Researchers, I guess in this group are academia, and they came together to design and jointly endorse a concise and measurable. Those words are bold just to emphasize the irony of them in this discussion, because I think they're sort of ironic, but I think it really expresses a goal that the group had who created these principles, that they wanted something that turned out to be concise and measurable, and these are called the FAIR data principles. So another thing about the FAIR principles is they sort of apply equally to data and metadata. Most of the discussion of them has been, in my experience at least, around data and FAIR data. So this idea of FAIR metadata, I think, is something that may be new. Maybe people here know that, or know of things that I'm not aware of. There's a lot going on in this space, obviously. But so these are the FAIR principles that provided some guidance about sort of metadata and metadata content. First is that data are described with rich metadata, and that's defined by R1. This is F2, one of the findable ones. And in the reusable one, metadata are richly described with a plurality of accurate and relevant attributes. So this is why I mentioned the irony of concise and measurable, because I don't, in my sort of way that I like to measure things, a plurality of accurate and relevant attributes is not super concise. And so one of our main goals really, or the goal of this work, is to try and define in a number of different metadata dialects what the important attributes are to support findability and access and interoperability and reuse. We also have the other R principles related to metadata. This is a little bit clearer. We should have a data usage license somewhere in the metadata, and And then, detailed provenance. So, I mean, you should have detailed provenance, and you all can go home and try and figure out what detailed provenance means. And that's one of the things we're doing today, trying to fill in these details, trying to take these FAIR principles and make them and contribute to the process of making them concise and measurable. One more, domain relevant community standards. So the work that we've been doing has been focused on 3 different metadata dialects that are used across elements of the ESIP community and other communities. One is the ecology metadata language used by LTER. One is ISO, the International Metadata Standards, and then the third is DataCite. So those are the 3 that we've sort of been thinking about the most. So if you're more familiar with other dialects, we'd love to have input from you on those, as well as the 3 that we've been working on. And the draft set of metadata elements was developed by Margaret and Sean and Matt and I and Peter and John and Daniela from CDL. So we have a fair amount of expertise in those 3 dialects. So that's why we did them, and there's a lot of mappings between those and others. So another attempt to define what the FAIR principles mean in terms of metadata came from the biomedical community, and they took FAIR and added TLC to it, traceability and license. This actually came out of the UK, and the word was actually licensure, but I couldn't fit that into the title, so I just shortened that to license and connectedness. And they sort of said a little bit more about what they think metadata should be. Metadata document, can you learn enough from the metadata to know if further effort with the data set is warranted? In other words, some people call that fitness for use. Is this data going to be fit for the purpose that I would like to use it for? Index, being able to find things, searchable using various mechanisms, and contactable. Contact information is readily discoverable. So this is a set of metadata guidance that came out, and I'll have some. There's the next slide actually. I just put this one here because they have these cool diagrams. This work was done by Mary Jane White at, I'm blanking on where she's from. I was just there in Portland. And she looked at a number, in this case, you can see there are 7 different rubrics for FAIR evaluation that she put together and tried to map between these rubrics and the FAIR principles. So this is sort of reflects the sort of plethora of work that's going on in this. And she has a great, a few people worked on this together. They have a great list of references here. That's a pretty good set of URLs and DOIs, identifiers for a fair amount of stuff. Well, rubric, this is the classic, educational definition of rubric, where a rubric is a contract for learning in an educational setting between a teacher and a student. So in the context of measuring metadata or evaluating something, a rubric usually has a number of steps in a number of areas. It's an evaluation framework is really, I think, the best word for it. Yeah, and the idea of many of the rubrics in the educational setting have sort of a set of 4 or 5 steps that you might go through to achieve a certain goal. And Mary Jane's in the library, comes from one of the side of this thing. But so rather than try and summarize these things, I decided to just sort of point you at them and then sort of go back to the beginning. The Open Archival Information System standard that was developed by a number of people, started at the NASA Space Science Data Center, Don Sawyer and Lou Reich. But this is a list of the 6 mandatory responsibilities in that model for repositories, and it's something I've always liked. and you can read this, obviously, the one that's, I think, most relevant to metadata, ensure that the information to be preserved is independently understandable to the designated community. In particular, users should be able to understand this without input from experts. And what I like about this in the whole OAIS idea is that it brings into the metadata evaluation process the designated community, the users. And that model also, proposed that designated community representatives interacted with the repository on a regular basis to ensure that the data remained independently understandable through time. And I really think, in my opinion, this is really the gold standard, really, for well-documented data sets. They're data sets that people can use independently and understand and trust independently of the people that collected them and created them. So the metadata evaluation that we're doing sort of starts to verge into that area, but most of what we're working on today is sort of simple measures of existence of metadata, and then consistency of that metadata, and then starting to verge into trying to evaluate that metadata in some automated way. And Matt will talk about that more, but so having such a great collection of users here, I think, is also really important as we try and develop these sort of simple and automatable measurements. So why are we interested in these? I wanted to talk about just a couple of reasons for that might not be obvious. So how many people are familiar with DataCite? That's good. Okay, good thing. DataCite is an interesting repository. It's interesting for a number of reasons. It has about 1,400 members, or 1,400 contributing. They're called clients now because DataCite's working on their business model, as so many of us are. And it has two things, providers and clients. So providers are organizations that give DOIs to their clients. And this is a plot of a measure of fairness using the first draft of the elements that we'll talk about, some of the elements that we'll talk about later today. And the score in this case goes from 0 to 26. On this plot are the 143 DataCite providers, and the number of clients that each of those has varies from 1 to 183. Over half of these providers only have one client, and that's themselves. So something like UNAVCO mints DOIs, and they mint DOIs for UNAVCO, and they only do it for UNAVCO. And those are the number of clients increases from the left to the right on a nonlinear scale. So all the ones that are just points in this picture are providers that only have one client themselves. Okay. And this is, the first draft of their measurements. So the highest ones are just above 20, around 21, and they go down to 8. So there's a lot of diversity in these numbers. This means that of 26, the easiest way to think about it is of 26 elements that are related to the FAIR principles, these groups have 8 of those. One of the interesting things about DataCite is that it actually has 7 mandatory fields. So you see in a lot of cases minimums of things that are either 7 or 8. So these guys have the mandatory fields, and actually they have the mandatory fields plus a URL, which isn't usually there. But so anyway, the other interesting thing about this is the data. Well, there's other interesting things. DataCite really has a lot of single client providers. On the right, we have the providers that have more than one client, and in those cases, the dots are the mean of their fairness, and the minimum and the maximum are indicated by the lines. So the reason that I put this up here, and then there's, of course, one of the reasons that DataCite is interesting is that a lot of members of ESIP have data in DataCite. And here's the names of some. We had a talk earlier today about IRIS, which you can see sort of in the middle of this picture. But the other important thing about DataCite is that there's a lot of people that are in the DataCite repository, multi-domains all over the world. I put ANDS in here because I was talking with Simon about ANDS the other night, so I put that in. ANDS has 61 clients, so it's pretty big. And so the ESIP community has a chance to really learn from a broad set of metadata creators and metadata users in DataCite land. And there's obviously, as we hone these elements, these numbers might change a little bit, but probably not all that much. And so there's a lot of diversity, and even within a certain provider, in a lot of these cases, there's a lot of diversity. Mike Daniels, we talked earlier today from UCAR. I'm happy to say that UCAR actually has some of the most complete DataCite metadata of this fairly large group, and in fact is in one part of UCAR that Mike works at, the Earth Observation Lab, is actually number 4 or number 5 out of 1,400. So we should give Mike a hand for. And of course, Matt Mernick, and Sophie, who unfortunately aren't here today, also had a lot to do with that. So learning from others is an important part. And then DataCite is also sort of an interesting dialect because it's only been around since 2011, and it's now in version 4.2. DataCite's working on version 4.3, and over that time period of just the last 6 years, DataCite, the dialect, has evolved quite a bit. And in this diagram, I show evolution of that dialect that has supported the FAIR principles. So in some cases, elements have been added, things, in some cases, code list members, code list words have been added. So those are things like is derived from, is source of. The affiliation in the middle here for 3.1 is a new element. So it's very important in these to do these multi dialect comparisons. ISO and EML are two of the most comprehensive metadata dialects in the business. They support all of the FAIR elements pretty well. DataCite is really focused on discovery, but in the past 6 years, the DataCite dialect is really starting to evolve. Now here comes Tricia, who's supposed to see this slide. The DataCite dialect, she's the executive director of DataCite. And this is the second time that she's heard me talk about DataCite. So I'm still saying good things. So DataCite can evolve and it can learn from the EML and ISO about ideas for accessibility and interoperability and reusability that DataCite really doesn't do much of. They're really focused on discovery. So we think about metadata evaluation as a mechanism for finding gaps sometimes in metadata, but there's two other really important things that I want you to remember. One is to learn from other people, identify good examples that are doing metadata well, and learn from them. Like, what are the systems that might be in place at some of these organizations that are up high on this list, and how can we take it, learn from them? And then the other is to try and evolve the metadata dialects to encompass new ideas that come up, like identifiers for people, identifiers for other kinds of things is something that a lot of the dialects are evolving towards. So anyway, I've been talking too long, and I guess if there's questions, I'm gonna not take questions right now, because I'm gonna just I'll be around in the rest of the thing. Oh, okay, yeah. Are there any questions or comments, or?
We do need to use the microphone.
Yeah, thanks. Mark.
Mark Parsons, Rensselaer Polytechnic. Thanks, Ted. So you said at the beginning that there's been a lot of talk about FAIR data, but not so much talk about FAIR metadata. And I just want to make sure I understand what you mean by FAIR metadata. It's not, it's all nice and fine for metadata to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, but that's not really the ultimate end. The ultimate end is to make the data all those things. And so when you say fair metadata, do you mean the metadata that we need for data to be fair, or do you mean just data being, metadata itself being fair? And I'm going to have a follow-up.
Thanks, Mark, for making that distinction, because what I mean is the former. The metadata that we need to help data be fair.
Okay.
And obviously that should be accessible and it's identified.
Right. I mean, your metadata has to be fair to be, for your data to be fair, but that's
right.
necessary but insufficient. So then where did you cut, and so that your 26 elements, you're looking at the data site thing.
No, point it at your mouth.
The 26 elements of the data type schema, so that was just your personal assessment or your group's assessment of the elements that you thought contributed to data fairness.
Right. Okay. Yeah, and that's it's the first draft of a set of elements that we hopefully in this group and in ESIP, probably maybe through the documentation cluster, will develop over the next time period. Okay. Yeah.
Gotta grab the mic.
Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, then we'll turn it over to Matt. We'll talk about fair metadata from the perspective of Data One and agencies.
Yeah, so I'm going to continue working down the same path that Ted was. He looked at data site metadata coming from that collection with one dialect. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on some of the richer metadata standards. So in particular, EML and ISO, and talk about that within the context of the Data One Federation. Data One's a federation of 42 repository systems around the world, and we've collated around 800,000 or so data sets that come from a wide variety of different providers around the world. And so it makes a really good corpus to be evaluating fairness within the broader metadata community and how people are working in the field. So over the last couple of years, Ted and I have had a grant called Metadig, where we're focusing on how to build metadata improvement and guidance tools. And one of the primary outcomes of that is that we built a set of tooling that allows us to compose a set of metadata checks into atomic small checks that check one particular thing within metadata and produce a score. And so we've built a very flexible system that allows us to compose sets of these checks into suites or recommendations that are of relevance to a community. So we've developed one of these for the Arctic Data Center. We have a different one for the ESS Dive repository. So each repository within Data One can have sort of one of these metadata quality checks, but we also can be developing them for community guidelines like FAIR. And so Ted and I, in the last part of this project, have embarked on trying to figure out what set of checks would be relevant to describing FAIR when you're trying to pick apart, say, a set of EML or a set of ISO metadata and figure out whether or not it meets the criteria for those different categories: findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And so I'm not going to go over these because Ted did, but our emphasis is to try to figure out what the set of information is that you need within a set of metadata records across repositories to meet each of these different FAIR categories. So in doing this, we've started developing a candidate list of those atomic checks. So we have a list of about 110 of these atomic checks for each of the categories, and we've implemented about 50 of those. So we've written code that will go through a set of metadata documents, pull out the relevant fields of metadata, and compare that to data sets, and then basically generate a composite score. And so what I'm going to show you here is a preliminary analysis of a little over 600,000 of the data sets from within the Data One network, kind of showing the kind of analysis that you might get from this type of a breakdown. I want to emphasize that these are preliminary results in the sense that we've only implemented about half of the checks that we've envisioned. And so there are many aspects of being fair that are not yet implemented in this suite. So there may be a very important piece of metadata we should be checking for that we haven't yet incorporated into this test run. Little later today, what we're going to do is have everybody break into groups and try to look at what those sort of sets of checks are and see what people think about the completeness of those. So keep in mind that these are preliminary results. None of them are things that should be quoted about the metadata dialects or other things, but nevertheless, it's pretty interesting. So first of all, if you look at a time series analysis of FAIR scores for the 687,000 EML and ISO documents that are in Data 1, you see that there's a pretty big trend towards we're doing a reasonably good job at findable and accessible, and quite a bit lower success at interoperable and reusable. And this might not come as a big surprise to people, but one thing you do see is that when you look at the time series of data sets across time, that interoperable and reusable are improving. So there was, back in 2004, we had a lot less metadata that was really, matching those particular fields. And that over time, that has stabilized out. Now these curves look really flat. It's like there's no change, right? But in reality, there's no change because it's a pretty massive corpus, and we're not really seeing a tremendous amount of drift in what the community as a whole is doing. If you plot that same data as monthly averages, so each point in this graph represents the average monthly FAIR score for the data sets that were updated in that month. So you can see, for example, if you look at the red line, on average, each month, people are hitting on the order of 75 to 100% of the FAIR metric tests are passing for the findable category. Whereas the light blue line for reusable is highly variable. Sometimes they're hitting as much as 60 or 70%, but sometimes they're down around 20%. So you can see from month to month, there's a tremendous amount of variability, and there's not like a temporal trajectory through time of improvement, right? There's just like, sometimes it's high, sometimes it's low, and on average, we're hitting around 50% through that. And so we need to be thinking about how we can change this graph to one that has kind of a linear trajectory towards improvement, as opposed to something that has a tremendous amount of noise and is just sort of variable for all these different data sets across institutions. So another thing that we can do with these checks is that we can slice and dice the data in different ways. And so one thing we can do, and we can look at all the EML documents and the ISO documents that are in the Data 1 repository network. So there's 119,000 EML documents and 567,000 ISO documents. And you can see that they're pretty comparable on findable and interoperable, findable and accessible. And they're both hovering around 75%. But the interoperable and reusable scores are quite different between those two standards. And I think that's, at this point, we looked into this a little bit, is because some of the fields that we use for the checks are not being checked within the ISO documents frequently. And so these are areas that we can identify for improvement, either in dialect evolution, like Ted was talking about, or in terms of the use of the dialect that's there and people aren't using it and can potentially be putting stuff in. So there's a pretty interesting set of analyses there. And then of course you can also break it down by provider. And so this is a subsample of the repositories within the Data 1 network. The first one's the Arctic Data Center that we operate at UCSB. You can see that there's again the same trend of sort of change over time is evident in all of them. The Arctic Data Center has got a lot of work to do on interoperable and reusable. We have, I think, a good trajectory. We're improving, but we need to think about what exactly we're doing on those metadata fields. Others, like EDI, is probably some of the highest set of consistent metadata across the board, across all four, even though they've only been sort of in this form for a few years. EDI is the Environmental Data Initiative. Yep. Is that how you brand it? We evolved from LTR. And then others like Pangea are again spread across the whole spectrum. And so, I think that the nice part about this data set is that it allows us to do an atomic look at not just how any given individual data set is performing against FAIR metrics, but also to evaluate collections of data sets, whether those are from standards or from repositories or lab groups or other types of groups. And so we can do this kind of analysis. And we're just now getting to the point where we can drill deeply into this kind of data. Now, the challenge with all of this, of course, is that you are what you measure. And, depending on what checks we define, different things will come out high and different things will come out low. And so we think it's really important to have kind of community agreement on what all of the different evaluative checks are that you could be checking for in representing FAIR. So we have been basically putting together a list of checks and implementing them, but we feel that this is a kind of a draft, or as Ted said, a candidate that we want really somebody to go through an evaluative working community process through ESIP. And then when we've got agreement on that, then Data One plans to implement that as a regular part of what we're reporting on all of the data sets that come into the network. So that's something that's part and parcel of the whole infrastructure that people who are part of the Data One network can make use of. So we started this process a couple months ago. We had a fair metrics workshop in March with a few of the groups that are part of ESIP, so Arctic Data Center, EDI and Margaret, the HDF group, KNB and LTR. We also had some representatives from CDL, so Daniela and John Chodaki were there as well. It was a great conversation. We spent a couple of days sort of diving deep into FAIR checks and what we should do. And that process, along with some cleanup afterwards, is what has produced the list of FAIR checks that we've identified. So I'm going to run through a couple of these just to give you a sense of what they look like. Many of the checks that we're doing right now are simple presence absence checks. So they're basically, if you want a data set to be findable, it should have a title, and that title shouldn't be empty, right? Title probably also shouldn't be one word. A title like river data, probably not so helpful on the discovery front, whereas a title that has 10 or 20 words and describes what's going on would be best. It would be really nice if we could check the content of that title and say, this is actually a semantically meaningful title that covers the time period, the spatial extent, the type of measurements that are being done. But that kind of check is hard to automate. And so we've tended to divide these checks into different parts. First, usually a presence absence check. Secondly, some sort of automatable machine check that gets at some aspect of whether the metadata is reasonable, like titles of link to are generally considered not adequate, whereas titles of link 15 to 20 are probably reasonable. And then we usually have a placeholder for one of these more semantically meaningful checks that are hard to implement, and we need ideas on how we can be checking those with computer programs. So you can see in the findable category, we have things like title, metadata identifier, the identifier for the resources and its type, the publication date, the abstract, any award or funding information, temporal coverage, spatial coverage, all that kind of stuff. And so there's a long list of those that we'll go over in a little bit. And then we've mapped each of those onto the FAIR principles and the sub-principles, and then indicated whether or not they're implemented fully or partially in our current checks. And so for accessible, you're getting checks for things like the presence of a publisher field or a distributor field, whether or not the identifier that's provided is actually retrievable, is dereferenceable. The resource distribution URL for the landing page and finding out whether that is present, retrievable, and what kind of protocol is being used. If it's a service that's providing the data, whether or not they provide the service URL and whether the data are accessible through that service. So these are all checks that can be run pretty straightforwardly. For interoperable, we're checking things like the metadata scheme. If somebody says that they're following the ISO 19139 metadata schema, does their schema document validate with respect to that schema? I can attest that having pulled in 600,000 metadata documents from ISOland, the vast majority on first pass don't validate. So we're not really there yet on creating valid metadata, even though everybody's closely following the standards, but not quite. Data format checksums, the definitions and names of attributes and variables within the data, these are all critical things for interoperability. And then for reusability, we're checking things like whether or not the data are licensed reasonably, whether or not they have a description of the resource, whether or not they have a full methods description. So do they provide a natural language text block that explains how the data were collected, what the experimental design was, whether or not the sampling was random or haphazard or observational or experimental, all those details that you need to interpret the data. We also need things like attribute units and the semantics of the attributes. And so all of these details, when you sort of break them apart, become hundreds and hundreds or possibly hundreds of different individual atomic checks that can be run against the FAIR system. So that's kind of an introduction to what we've been doing in the process and where we are. At this point, I think we'll pause for some questions, and then in a minute we'll break out into breakout groups. And what we'd really like to do is to form 4 breakout groups and start to really dive into these different things. But let's start with a bit of a discussion in the room about what we've done and see what people think, and we'll then move on to the breakouts from there. So I think Kirsten's first. Sorry.
I think this is really interesting. And just one question. So when you were going through, you listed some of the kind of checks for each of the FAIR principles. Have you also looked at, like in doing that, have you looked at what other groups and organizations have done in terms of their checks? NASA has also been doing that for years as well. So I see some of the same things. So like I see some of the same thing in terms of like what's being checked and you know how that's related and communicated before. So I'm just curious about how you went about that process initially.
Yeah, so we are definitely aware of a number of other initiatives trying to do this. Within the FAIR community, there are a number of groups creating metrics spaces that are usually human interpretable metrics. So they're things where somebody's evaluating subjectively whether something meets that principle and then saying yes or no. So there's a bunch of efforts like that. The CMR and NASA sort of system is another. I think Ted is extremely familiar with that and has helped us to use that. And then another one that we've used is so EDI and the Environmental Data Initiative and LTR before it collaborated with us over the last bunch of years to build a metadata parsing engine for EML. And so LTR has for a long time had a metadata evaluation service that has a lot of these checks built in. And that's one of the reasons their corpus scores really well, is because they've been systematically checking that metadata for quite some time. And so we have definitely evaluated all of the checks that they do and made sure that we've encompassed those as well. So yeah, I think we need to look at all these different community initiatives and try to get something that represents a superset and come to some community agreement instead of, like, I think it's great that individual groups are doing it, but what we need is sort of community agreement on what it means and how to map it to dialects instead of individual people's systems. And so that's what we're hoping in this group we can do, is we can kind of start moving across agencies and across academic groups and make this all work. So Kirsten?
Hello, hello.
Yeah, there are some. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. Go ahead.
You know, the questions that we actually try to have sort of recommendations that don't need all these very specific of metadata. Governance of these methodologies. To say this is the new chemistry standard for that type of data. Have you talked?
Okay, so there were two parts of the question. I think the first part of the question was that there's a lot of detailed metadata about provenance and traceability and other things that we would want in the reusability category, and how do we deal with all the domain-specific ways in which that needs to be represented. Is that fair? All right, and so that part of the question, I would say, there are a lot of different approaches to doing it, and right now what we've been thinking is we'd want just some representation of the provenance and traceability as opposed to none. Right now we have no indication whether people are doing that at all, and many people are not representing that kind of information in their metadata. So there are very few metadata documents that have detailed provenance traces in them when you look across large corpuses. So, I think just starting off with which repositories and which, communities are producing some level of documentation of that is a good start. It would be nice to continue down that domain-specific path and then find out, whether they're following those community standards for things. But I'm not sure that that's as critical as trying to get interoperability at the higher level at this point. And then the second part of your question, I have to think what, say? Oh, right, the governance. No, we haven't talked about governance. At this point, this has been a project that Ted and I have been undertaking, and we've been working with a community of people and exposing it. We really think that ESIP is a great group because it's an on-the-ground group that can help us to define standards. RDA obviously has they have a fair metrics working group as well and could definitely be part of the solution for how we move forward on agreement. I think that's an open question as to how community agreement on this gets moved forward.
Right, and just to respond a little bit to Tyler's question about various other community recommendations, the work that we've done in Metadata is really across maybe 40 or 50 different recommendations. And so in these tests, there's 100 of these tests, so let's say there's 120 of them. A lot of them will overlap with, say, the CMR tests or the NOAA rubrics that we did. And in the system that Matt mentioned at Data One, you can select the recommendation that you're interested in testing, and you can test against multiple recommendations, and that's the typical approach. Sean.
Hey, thanks, Ted. This, again, is to speak to Tyler's question about different communities coming up with different ideas of what FAIR is. And I just wanted to push back against the idea of a FAIR superset recommendation, because as Ted mentioned earlier, the metadata has to make the data understandable to a user. And as we know, different communities have different information needs to make a resource understandable. So how can we, or should we, incorporate all of those differing information needs into one superset recommendation? I mean, it sounds to me like that's a fairly large metadata record when we could just have different representations that speak to the different communities.
Yeah, I don't think this is an either or. I think Ted's quote at the beginning of his talk, I think, is what motivates us, is that, when we talk about FAIR, people talk about it as if it's one monolithic thing. And the I think conception is that it's concise and measurable. But when you actually look at the FAIR principles, they're neither concise nor measurable. And so what we're trying to do is to provide a degree of structure and agreement about what the overarching concept of FAIR represents, without taking away from the idea that there are still disciplinary and community specific recommendations that can and should be followed, that probably provide more detailed guidance for those communities than what FAIR alone can do. FAIR is a very general set of principles, right? It's not going to get into the, say, if you're looking at, Earth observations from satellite imagery and you have a specific set of understandability requirements, that's probably not going to be captured by a general FAIR suite, but it should be captured by something else. Well, then is it FAIR? Yeah.
I think that, I hope that we're going to have a lot of interesting questions to talk about during this process. And today, this morning, Carl was talking about the clusters. And of course, Sean is actually the current co-chair of the documentation cluster. And so we have a mechanism in ESIP to carry this forward. Mark or Aaron mentioned the citation detail, the citation guidance. That was also done in a cluster. So I, as a past chair of the documentation cluster, hope that that's a forum where we can go beyond this this breakout group exercise today, the initial exercise. The other thing about convergence and community standards, when you start at F and you go towards R, it's sort of interesting because there's a lot more convergence on F, on findability and the ways that we search for things and try and discover things. And as you go through accessibility with maybe community specific formats or conventional things in formats through interoperability, I like Kai's discussion this morning of I. I is definitely a difficult thing, and R. So as you go, as you what I say is putting the air in fair. As you start to put that air in, you get into a much more diverse situation. So that's why data site is interesting. It has a lot of focus on multidisciplinary discovery, really. Other questions? Yeah.
Go that it is. You gotta aim it down. This is too okay. Okay, I'll try not to move except. Okay, so this work about like bridging to these other communities, like the Go Fair community and others who are coming up with criteria, and they're steaming ahead, right? And in the Go Fair community, it's all over RDA, and the EU is looking at that for grant evaluations, right? Once it gets to that level, then it's kind of stuck. So I would really hope that this conversation happens early, because I really agree with that. These are principles, and we all know it. Like, can you find stuff? Can you access it? And can it interoperate, and with what, right? So if we just get I like the technical approach here to say, hey, look, here's just a way to evaluate it for different communities in different contexts. That's useful, and I think it's more about people are treating FAIR as if it's a standard and not a set of principles, right? And it's not, and the people are being forced into like weird places through this, or so just sort of saying like it's a guideline for a set of activities that help us converge, and then emphasize that that's just the first step. It's not the end point. You get a FAIR metric, it's just the first step to start a conversation about closer data interoperability. I really like the seismic presentation this morning. They figured it out for their system, and it worked so well that others adopted it. And I think that's the sort of thing that RDA and others can help push forward a little bit, because we need it. We need it.
Any questions online in the chat, or other questions here? Okay, so now we've got links that are on the slide, and they're a little hard to type, not that bad, but they're all in the description for the session. So if we could, I don't know if you want to move around or not move around, if we want to do like F, A, I, and R. How many people are interested in looking at the F? All right. No, yeah, F are small. Yes. Excuse me. How many people are in? So F, maybe we can do F here, sort of in the front. It looked like we have maybe five-ish kind of people. How about A? Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Uh-oh, this is going to be hard.
Yeah.
Okay, how about, what are the other ones?
I.
I. Okay, Kai. Does that mean everybody else is R, or everybody else is afraid to volunteer? This is R.
Okay.
So do we want to do, I mean, it
Let's
seems
make
like
two. Let's do
wanna
two
do
R
this
groups.
together?
Let's do R over here in the front corner, but have this phase, and then just break it apart two groups. Yeah. I's in the back. A's in the back over there. That's up here.
F, A, I, and R. Is that a move? We should do this in order.
All right.
Right. Okay, so.
So, well, let me give just a quick view of what this represents. So when you look at the GitHub repository, you're going to see a series of issues. Each issue corresponds to one of these atomic checks, and each of the issue is named with a sort of a three-part name. Each part represents the sort of major concept that's being checked, the property that would probably be checked in that, and then kind of an indication of what kind of check is being performed. So in the first one I have example here is in the data set, the description, the methods concept is present. So they have a methods description. Compared to like the next one, I have a description here of, which is one of the data entities, like say a raster image or a data table, has a list of attribute units, and that list of attribute units is present. And that would be different from whether or not, say, the attribute names are unique within the data set, or whether or not the attribute names have good definitions within the data set, and things like that. So each one of those is there. And what we're asking you to do is to do two things. One is review the list for your letter and figure out if there are things that either do or don't fit and should be in there and are not in there. So feel free to create new issues that represent new types of checks. And then secondly, you can comment on the existing ones, and sort of there's 4 sort of sections within the thing. Basically the type of the check, whether or not it should be required for fairness or not, a description of that, so a definition of what that check represents, and any issues you think we might encounter in trying to implement that check. And so if you perceive of difficulties or community differences, then please go ahead and fill those in. And so I'll go and navigate here to one of these.
Yeah, and you know, the breakout group does not need to come to consensus because all of you as individuals can enter issues into GitHub. If there are people here who are unfamiliar with that, are there? No, okay, probably not. You know, it's type stuff in, press the button.
Yep.
And there probably are people in the groups that know how to do that if you need help. But so we would like to have, you know, if there is a group consensus about something, that would be great. If there's not a group consensus, we can deal with that. And these Git repositories, you know, will be an evolving description of the checks that we think are useful in their status.
Okay, so we have until, what's our close time?
We have until 11:45.
Yeah.
So we had, somehow you and I both went over our time.
Yeah, we also had a long QA, but that's okay.
So, yeah, we'll go till about 20 of or 25 of, and then if we want to have a break, a report back or anything, or more questions and answers, and obviously Matt and I are going to float around. Maybe an opportunity to build on this during my workshop. Yeah. There's another session right after lunch about metadata evaluation in a couple of different repositories, and after that is version 4 of Sean's metadata workshop, which is some, I think, Jupyter notebooks for implementing checks like this in sets of recommendations in different dialects. So that is build off of the FAIR recommendation that we've been building and run it against people's metadata. Yeah, so that's the second session that's happening. Yeah. Okay, let's move. Break out.
You know, moderators, you don't know who.
No, there's too many people. These are slides.
Yeah, so we've got.
I know, you're taking pictures of them. I can see all of it though.
Here, I wanted to.
And so can you send these slides to me?
Yeah. I wanted to explain them.
ESIP collects all the slides from the
Oh, they
meeting all
do?
in one place, so they'll be up there.
I want to send them now to the team.
Yeah. So
It was a perfect picture.
This
We've had a time
is
to just
a draft
highlight you and
Right,
and there's the total, the maximum that you can get.
right,
These are all of the providers.
right, right.
And they're organized by the number of clients. And then these are the maximum fair score among their clients and everything. So for this provider right here, they have multiple clients, but they all have very similar metadata. These guys, whereas some of these others, like, and actually if we go like this, then we see who some of these are like that. So Ann's has 61 different clients and they have a range of things. So, not really. Well, no, because then these would be going like this. So it's really, you know, it's really organizational values, organizational systems, and heterogeneity of clients and stuff like that. But then these guys are all just one client. You know, they are like, UNAPCO, or NSIDC. So even in groups that just have themselves, you know, they're still sort of a complete range. And 8 is just 7 mandatory fields probably, and then in the JSON there's a URL.
So let me make sure I understand this. So 20, that means there's 20 so explain that 20.
Yeah, so there's 26 measures
Okay.
that are all measures of completeness.
Okay.
So they go from 0 to 100%.
Right. Right.
So if half your records have something, you get a 50% for that.
Okay.
And then you sum all those up.
Mm-hmm.
And so because there's 26 of them, and
Right.
they each could be one, the
Right.
maximum you could get to is 26.
Right.
So that's what this is.
So these guys are here doing well.
Yeah. And UCAR, but yeah, UCAR is interesting. They have two.
Who's this over here?
I can look at my spreadsheet and tell you.
That's fascinating. Because one of the things I'm trying to look at is there.
Who's this right here? These guys are good, right? We've got, this is 183 clients, which is what the biggest one is.
So what we're trying to figure out is if you have one provider of all of those clients, does their quality of management?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, that's what we should be able to do is to, collapse these guys. So if you went to one provider and you said, okay, so you've got 15 different clients, and here are the good examples, and here are the opportunities for improvement. Could we take your good client? Or your more complete clients, and use them to help the others as good examples. So across the top here are sets of good examples.
Right.
And we know who they are. Well, I try and avoid using words. Yeah. But these guys out here, these guys have 183 clients, and they're over half. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's also the systems that they provide. That's USGS.prod.
Yeah.
NOAA is NOAA, NCBI, and maybe one other. But one of the things about those, there are groups here who have large metadata systems of their own. And NOAA is one, ESDIS is certainly one. And so they're sort of doing the minimum of data. But and I sent you that HTML, right? So most of those are the fields. I've been tweaking them a little bit. But ESDIS could be provided as spatial and temporal. They've got that for all the data. And hopefully,
But it's not
they don't give it
expressed
the
as
data.
Right.
And
This is super interesting.
yeah,
It's.
well, I will send you this. I want to talk to you about it before I send it to you.
Right.
But yeah, I just did this plot.
Oh, you did?
I was like, this is really cool. And look, I can organize it this way and it looks good.
Yeah.
But and then the next one is this.
So, but also, what I'm looking at is taking this data and seeing what is going on with the site now and saying, it's no longer dependent on plot around. So I think there's some other kind of interesting.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, as I do this analysis, I also extract the number of records they have every year, and then the number of the types, the resource type genders, because there could be variation across that. I haven't had a chance to start looking. And also, then there's what schema version. It's remarkable in a lot of these metadata that in the JSON, the schema version isn't there.
So really?
Like most, which is really sort of surprising.
Right.
Because that JSON, we should know that schema for every record. But yeah, and that's where this evolution comes in. Most of the things, many of the things that we're measuring started out in 2.0, like the mandatory fields, then the data format, which is that's an interoperability thing. rights is accessibility. But then during time, I've looked at all this,
And what's been added.
yeah, what's been added, and a lot of work on rights, and then
This is a good side, a nice way to express it visually. I like it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like this sort of timeline presentation. And I think you heard my discussion here, the data site is really concentrated in methods. And we might think about migrating data site into AIR in some ways.
This is really cool though. Nice job. Thanks for talking about data science. That's a big chunk of data to play around with.
Yeah, and that was, in this slide. So here I said, we've got a lot of diversity in the thing that's interesting about data set is the diversity of the partners.
So one of the other things we're going to do is do subject taxonomy and add that to the metadata.
Yeah. Are you going to use the one that Re3 Data uses, the German one?
No, I forget which one it is. It's so simple. I mean, it's just like take a first swipe at this and just to see what happens. But then, you're thinking like, is there certain subjects that are better than others?
More complete. We don't use
Yeah, more complete. And then, because for us, like this kind of that's great. So you're talking about.
Does the considerable work being done now in space agricultural measurement, satellite agricultural measurements, either impact or get used in how you're working with the drone data and pipeline?
Yeah. I mean,
So like, big thing for the CIS community, and that can all be used But because they're well described around the principles, they are variable nature make it so I don't know what's happening around and say that, there's I think they just like quality like that. That's the sort of thing that I'm trying to figure out ways that similarly subjective and objective ways.
What I'm going to do is we're not and the system. So those are all.
Thanks, Chris. On your software handling, your stuff's in GitHub. Are you doing any kind of automation, continuous integration to when you tweak something in the pipeline, how it gets over to machines and things?
There's still a big pile of metadata that's back here. Right?
Yeah.
So, you know, and that's why resource type general, resource type general only became mandatory in 2015. So there's a shitload of stuff back here that doesn't have resource type general. And, and then there's the identification, the affiliation thing that's what Danielle and I are doing this afternoon, because in that case, the repositories actually say we are going to improve this community. And we're adding 40,000 unique roars to drive.
So you are.
And all the, and they're used in many places. Currently there's 0. So here's a case where not only did we find the affiliations, now we're putting in the identifiers. So that's a very proactive role for the process.
So here's where I get confused on fair. So when you talk about adding or these to the drive, do you think that makes the data A, I, or R?
Well, I think it depends on, I have affiliation in F.
You do.
So that you can search for metadata that came from Harvard University, or but and you have this question about related, yeah.
Right.
So these are 2 related
Right.
guys here.
Right.
This is a related guy here.
This is a reputable institution. This is,
Yeah.
you can make some comparisons.
Right. Yeah, and of course, and it could be, certain of these tests could happen in multiple cycles.
Right.
If you look at the stuff that I've got the data site, the vast majority of them are F. And AI and R are all F.
Right.
Because they've also got, so I have plots of all these things in this radar plots
Right.
for all numbers. We could spend some time looking at those.
So, but your related is here is derived from the sources. So you would put that.
Well, that was added in 3.1.
Right.
And it's sort of provenance, right?
Exactly.
The beginning of provenance of the data. And then there's described by is something that points to richer metadata.
Right.
And then we have funder stuff that describes the same data paper is here's a paper about these data. So that's part of usability and trustability.
Right.
Because most of the F stuff, most of these things have been there since the very beginning. And the bold ones are the mandatory.
So did you get any questions from the group on any of this?
Not yet.
Yeah.
Publications that's one of the reasons that I put those names in. And UCAR, I've already talked to Mike and Matt there.
Yeah.
So it's how do you verify where it's a way about Mike, Mike Daniels. And the same they're called stick planes, stitching, or signposts.
Oh, right. Signposting, that's from correspondence.
Well, this is the signpost. It's a number of process.
Oh, I thought you were talking about.
Yeah, the signposting, yeah, but it has the most complete cross-reference stuff. And I sent an email to the editor-in-chief, and he's like some completely esoteric condensed matter physicist. And he was like, "Oh, this is so cool."
It does.
So finding the good people, finding the good examples is really important.
But it's interesting that.
Maybe wonder where they are.
You know?
Yeah.
So it's not bad.
Yeah.
But I'd be curious to know.
Yeah, I can in the spreadsheet on my computer, it doesn't really all are. I'll send you the slides. The slides is just, yeah, this is from just a paper with what these people say is measurable. It's a measurable goal.
Okay.
Yeah, but anyway, so I'm gonna wander about.
Okay,
But yeah,
sorry.
I would be happy to talk to you or
Yeah.
talk to
The team, yeah, yeah. That's,
yeah,
super interesting.
we got some discussion going on. This is yeah, I know. Questions, answers, this group has a lot of answers. Maybe there aren't. What?
So maybe you can help us to identify how we can attack the vision.
Where's the boundary of it?
You can attack in some incredibly efficient, expedited way. You know, the main thing, if there's something that's obviously really missing, I think it's just one of the things we might do in a short time. I think that these issues, like so many different things, can be addressed over time by participants that are here and others. So, you know, we don't need answers today, but one of the things is there are people here who are pretty familiar with a lot of these dialects and others. And Megan said, well, the thing that's really missing here from this is from F is this, or AI and R are more obscure. Are we in an R or what group is F? Yeah, well, if there are ways that you think, I tend to think about F as the ways I might expect people to search for metadata. So Trish and I were just talking about affiliations. So affiliations are important if you want to find work that was done by some group. But they're also, she said, they're also important for reuse because they tell you know, if something came from a reputable source, you know, NOAA and NASA have this kind of, you know, seal of approval for data, something that comes from, you know, something that comes from a much smaller, unknown, you know, group or something that comes from some of the interesting climate science groups. You know, you might have a different idea about what you trust. So a lot of these could be in multiple places, and that might be a. As far as I know, none of the tests right now are in multiple letters. But I'm a little bit, so there are things that are in F that might also help support I or R. I'm not sure if they are.
We just did that because, you know, a lot of tests which always takes a question is you know, the best is going to be good is if you are right, which points to something somewhere else. The I categories or the R principles or something. So it's more of a
Yeah.
it's a tangled web.
Yeah, and that's fine. I mean, you know, the idea is that we have many things that can be grouped in different ways, and the different communities might want to, which definitely group in different ways. So that's
We did all this review.
yeah. I mean, similar stuff. Yeah, different recommendations in different communities and the research turned out that there's something called RO Hub. Are anybody familiar with that? The Research Object Hub. They have a system which is sort of identical in concept and implementation, where they have a bunch of different tests, and then they break them up into different groups. And that's no problem.
I guess, and we have some really good ideas about what checking it, if there's and we talked about a lot of ways to ensure that the content is good. But for these issues, like issue 69, data set creator presentation, should we say, and the issue here is what is a computer? So do we answer that by giving an opinion on what users are going to name, or should we give our knowledge about where that content can be found in other standard guidelines?
I think right now, at this initial phase, I would say it's mostly conceptual, and not so much mapping. Okay, so Tyler's here. I know that he has a lot of ideas about how these things, where they might exist in probably ZIP or in CMR lanes, and adding that mapping is something that would be something that happens in the future. But so yeah, should you have names or should you have given families? Most of the dialects actually have names. The data site has names and given names. So they can be like, so this is really an introduction and there's what?
So with this issue, like, I mean, I agree, a little bit at a loss for help.
Okay, well, hopefully, becoming familiar with it is the first step, and maybe as the community thinks about it, there will be good examples. Yeah, NASA has this maybe less of an example, but it's we're very open. So, present apps plus 18 years. And when those diverse set of inputs start disagreeing, then we're trying to figure out how the most. I'll start with the ones that fall in the 90s. So these sort of fit in the way that I think the reason we're trying to get them a lot more automated and able to find those.
I do think in terms of like environmental data is essential. We want all of them, but then we narrow it down to the essential set.
If this document exists, that's
the essential checks and separate those from desirable.
Well, it's very typical in recommendations to have multiple levels of recommendations. And I like the word essential. I like it better than mandatory because scientists don't like to required. Yeah, there's required, there's mandatory, there's essential, there's recommended, there's suggested, there's optional. So I would be, and one in the architecture that Data One was developed, you can say this check is mandatory, this check is suggested or recommended check. Those decisions about the requirements, the level of requirements are made at the recommendation level. So one community might decide that taxonomic extent is critical, like logical EML kind of thing, and taxonomic extent is like doesn't exist in data. So some that's not a good example. What's a good example? So it might be, spatial extent might be really important in earth science, but it might be not so important in space or in life science. So yeah, and if you have ideas about these tests and whether they should be mandatory or not, your community is, you're
Hey, can you hear me?
so, but having that flexibility, we don't need to decide. This field is required for all, data science assessment questions, and they sort of, most of the records have those. There are actually some that don't, I'm not sure how they got there. So there's a set of 10, maybe sort of required things for the
But I think again, it's context specific. There's not going to be
we're trying to get the communities the best possible, broadest possible framework.
But the remote sensing data would be really great. That'd be a great staff check. Description of the outcome. So can we
international representation? One of the nice things about Easter is that I come from another planet. Right. So if I say something, then here's a couple of things that you can check the presence absence.
No, I come from science.
If it is genomic data, here's a bunch of other things.
Well, we have a guy who can help you with that wall if we want to take him off our hands.
No, I think he's about to get an experience. Number 10. That's what scares us.
This is where we've been trying to just start.
It looks like there's about 4 of these that are
I would say getting ideas to supply
We're trying to do they've developed basic keywords inside the repository, and then Google goes and indexes that entire makes it much more suitable for That's just as a working group, essentially there's a bunch of chats, collection of all the DAX and it puts in a specific, basically specific data. We use that treatment. The DAX are. So when we get that information in, we ingest that into our archive center. We have whatever that metadata is for that product or that piece of information that's coming in, we'll map it to that keyword. So we do that. But it would be really awesome if providers could already come in with some of that.
Yes, and then you get in a lot more subjective meaning as to what that keyword is actually saying. Are you familiar with the kind of stuff that Impact is doing with machine learning? So like looks at like abstract or whatever, takes out all these things.
Okay, everybody, we have about 5 minutes left in the session, and I wanted to kind of reconvene. So maybe take a minute to wrap up your last conversation there, and then we'll. It's remarkably quiet for like a huge group of people.
I was just
It's
gonna
a
say,
dull
we have some good discussion going
Yeah,
on.
absolutely. So what I was thinking we would do is just ask each group to sort of make any comments they had about the process.
Yeah, we also are
Where
gonna
we're
need to
going.
write down takeaways from this session, so,
That's right.
so that would be
Yeah.
good if we can write this down.
Okay, so maybe we should get a computer out for that then.
Yeah, well, we can probably do it right in here.
Okay, my name is John
Okay.
Graybeal,
Yeah.
and I
can
know
type in.
many of you. It's nice to see a few faces that I've known by remotely for a long time and worked with. I'm working at Stanford.
Okay, so thanks for your input. This is obviously the beginning of a long and relatively complicated process. Many of the groups I walked around was talking to many of the groups, and it's really
Yes.
switch.
Yeah.
It's really easy to get hung up in all of the details. It's also really easy to sort of think that you want to estimate something perfectly, and it's difficult to do that. And so you sort of quickly, so remember where we're starting from, FAIR principles that say things like, you shall have rich metadata, right? And we're trying to operationalize that into something that's more useful to the community for evaluation. And so I think we want to be careful to not dive to a level that is, basically makes it impossible for us to actually implement it in the foreseeable future. That said, it's really useful to identify all these really hard, challenging problems as well. So what I'd like to do in the last couple of minutes is just go through and see if there are comments from each of the groups about both what they did. Do you have a comment on where the checks are they reasonable? Did you add more? But also about the process we might use and like how we might, as a community, move forward on identifying a set of checks that we have some level of agreement represent FAIR for operational purposes. So maybe we'll start and we'll go ahead in the FAIR direction and start with Findable and see what they think.
Well, we looked at some of the checks and had some. We can try to point the end right at the antennas. Does this work now? Hey, look at that. It's science. Don't worry about it. So here in the FAIR group for findability, we looked through the checks and we generally agree that these checks for presence are necessary. And looking at some of them, like what's a significant name for a creator, it's very standards specific. So there's not really a one solid answer that we can give. But we touched upon ideas like that I think will fit into a FAIR superset in identifying what's essential to FAIR. And when we can boil it down to that, then we have that superset that then groups can build off of to get more FAIR for their specific community. One thing that we would like to add, and we did add as an issue, is that schema.org metadata makes something very findable very quickly. So we would like to see that as a check for a record. Is there a schema.org representation of this? And if there is, then check, it's findable.
There is one in there. Check. Might not be under findable.
Better search mechanism. Okay.
So yeah, I'll pass it along.
Acceptable. Who wants to? Anybody? Comments?
We agreed generally with the requirements or optional categories. Make it all the way through. But we did feel that having a glossary for
Did you catch that, Ted? Would be useful. interoperable.
Check. Yes. Okay. I won't move. All right. So Kai here from the one interoperable groups we split up. So we had just a variety of things. We added an issue about annotations linking to ontologies, not exclusively, but preferring the use of oh boy, funny. preferring the use of, oh my god, preferring the use of ontologies over okay, don't move here. Okay, so attempting to the use of ontologies, but not exclusively over controlled vocabularies for better access to the sub-principles of I2, 3, and I1, 2, and 3 being the qualified resources, accessibility, and vocabulary.
It's an angle thing. Yeah, exactly. So the attributes are the activity in the sense that it's the attribute on the attribute level where the interoperability is likely to happen. I think the other group also found that. And defining them clearly for humans and machines was part of it. But there were also discussions about, is in some cases are definitions like that necessary when you have a data model like with dates, Isn't it more useful to just do that on the data level or and that save over knowledge representation activities? We also looked at some of the checks in here, which were suggested, for example, the number of words in a definition being 4. And there are some cases where perhaps that's sufficient. And, one would need a more advanced check, but of course that has higher overhead. Like, for example, how do you do that? How do you even evaluate it? So, but if you just check that the definition is there, that's one step. Also, if you have a resolvable IRI to something that defines it, it's another. And if that IRI leads to other IRIs, when you hit a class, that shows that it has the potential to be it's no guarantee, but it's potentially interoperating with other resources. It's linking on and on and on. And that depth of linkage is perhaps a good indicator to consider.
All right, and then reusable. Anybody have any comments from up here? Yep, I think there's 2. So did you create any new issues?
Consider one issue in terms of provenance. Maybe rather than trying to evaluate provenance as something needs a better way for people to report the provenance.
Right. 10 days. That's right, you brought that up, right? You create that? Perfect.
Okay, we have a second reusable.
Okay, so we looked at the GoFair facets and decided that the first 2 were pretty easy and you had those covered, but the third one is domain relevant community standards. And was pretty much, there's nothing in this list, that's not a surprise. And we also, one of our conclusions is that reuse pretty much always has context, and that's how somebody is going to want to use it. So we kind of dived into thinking about how you would evaluate fitness for purpose, and that it almost always requires a human. So we did started to design a few checks that actually might look for particular aspects of things that a human would look for, like we will put them into issues, but they're not there yet. There are things like, are there references for taxa? Are there vocabulary requirements that are met?
Has this data set been used before? Has it been cited? Does there a scientific peer review as in a data paper? Some forms of user community review or other kinds of annotations or maturity checks. Annotations and citations, yeah, I think we got those. Anyway, that was very vague, but we have a collection of notes which they tell me I should just dump into one issue and say, here, reuse this.
Okay, we do have a few people online. I'm sorry about the challenges with the microphone. Does anyone online have any questions or comments?
So
okay,
thank everybody. And
yeah, thanks very much. And as we've said a few times, we hope this is a useful and ongoing process. And does anyone think doing it or discussing this in the documentation cluster makes sense? You can raise your hand. Okay, because if this would be more people if in the documentation cluster calls than the sum of them all for the last year. So having a new drive and a new focus for that group is a positive thing. So thank you very much.
thanks.